skills. And now to my third question. What's the effect of competition on how well people do, for example, at work or at school? Let's begin by understanding that excellence and victory, in theory, are two completely different ideas. You can work on any kind of task and try to be really good at it without ever trying to defeat other people who are working on it too. That should be obvious. But it isn't always, because in many cultures we have come to confuse or conflate the idea of excellence and competitiveness as if they're the same thing. We even talk about how do we help our country or our company be more competitive, as if that was understood to mean better. But it doesn't. Maybe one leads to the other in theory, but it's certainly possible that we can have excellence without competition. Let's start with that. Now, let's look at whether competition does lead to excellence, and the answer is almost always no. I'll summarize the research this way. And by the way, this surprised even me. When I started years ago on this research project, I was already convinced that competition is not great news for us psychologically or interpersonally. But I kind of assumed, because I had heard it all the time, that competition motivates people to do their best, and if there was no competition, people wouldn't try hard. So there might be a trade-off here where we have to, give up some performance, some achievement, in order to have happier, healthier people. I was wrong. It turns out that competition is as destructive to productivity for adults and children across cultures as it is destructive to us psychologically and in our relationships with one another. Not only is competition not required for excellence, usually its absence is required for excellence. That is so unexpected and so threatening for many people to accept, given that they've been socialized, raised on this diet of believing that competition is good for you and we need to compete more and better. That's why I started with this professor's research studies on collages and business people doing puzzles, to get you in the frame of mind of realizing something is different than what we've assumed is the case. And those studies are just among dozens and dozens of studies that I review in my book. Again, with males and females, adults and children across cultures, and with many different tasks. The only time you find that competition can boost achievement is when you're looking at short-term results on very simple, mindless kinds of activity as measured in quantitative terms. So for example, if I took all of you here today and I gave you a pile of envelopes and said, your goal is to lick as many envelopes closed to seal them as you can in 10 minutes. And half of you I just asked to do it, and the other half of you I said, there's going to be a prize for the best envelope licker. Yeah, in a case like that, where there's no reason anybody would want to do it, where there's no thought involved, where it doesn't carry over to anything tomorrow, it may be the case that those motivated to get the prize and be the best would lick more envelopes. But in the workplace, I have been looking now for about 35 years, and I have never found a single controlled scientific study that finds any long-term benefit to the quality of performance from any kind of competition. In fact, I can't even find any benefit in the workplace to any non-competitive incentive plan or bonus or pay for performance scheme. And I'll say more about that in a moment. Competition tends to hold us back from doing our best, particularly when we're interested in tasks that require some degree of creativity or higher order thinking or critical thinking or understanding or learning. I have found no meaningful tasks in a school setting that involve learning where it ever makes sense to pit students against each other, where the point is to win. Winning pulls in this direction. Learning pulls in that direction. Why does the research find this to be true? Why does competition undermine excellence, particularly on the most meaningful tasks? I have been thinking about this for a while. Again, if I was there in person with you, I would ask you to be speculating in general or about those two studies in particular. But let me go ahead and tell you what I think. First, competition often makes people anxious. If I'm worried that you're trying to step on my face and get ahead of me, I am not able to focus on the task in an ideal way. Second, when people are thinking about winning, they have this tendency to attribute their success or failure to factors outside their control. To think of it as, I'm just smart, or I'm just stupid, or I'm just lucky or unlucky. Research finds this to be true, especially with children. So when you have people compete, they tend to explain the results of the competition in ways that are not based on their effort. And attributing your success or failure to effort turns out to be the most productive going forward. Therefore, competition in the long run holds people back. Third, a lot of students know at the very beginning of the year who's likely to be a winner on academic terms. They see which kids answer the questions fastest or whatever. That kid who is almost guaranteed to be a winner has no motivation to learn beyond what's necessary to be number one in the class, to keep pushing herself, to learn more deeply. Because the goal you set up now isn't to learn deeply, it's to beat everybody else. Meanwhile, all the other students who are pretty sure they're never going to win are demotivated by definition. That's the effect of competition. Everyone loses. Next, if competition has the destructive effects that I mentioned before, where it undermines self-esteem and makes it conditional, and destroys our relationships with one another, of course it's going to undermine excellence too, because people who feel good about themselves and supportive of and supported by those around them are in the best position to succeed. Therefore, when competition undermines those things, it also undermines excellence. And finally, the last explanation, which gets back to my workplace research that I mentioned a moment ago. I don't care how motivated students are or employees in a workplace. I care about how they're motivated. Psychologists tell us that there are different kinds of motivation, and the kind matters more than the amount. Many of us think of motivation as a single entity. It can go up, it can come down. We can have more of it, we can have less of it. It's on a hydraulic lift. And thus, when we talk about how do we motivate children, we ask, how do they have more of this stuff called motivation? Psychologists distinguish between intrinsic motivation, which means doing something because you really enjoy it, and extrinsic motivation, which means you do it in order that something outside of the task, extrinsic to the task, happens, like you get a reward for succeeding. There is a world of difference between a child who creates a science experiment because she really wants to know whether this affects that and whether this idea will work. And on the other hand, a child who does a science experiment to get a ribbon, to get a prize, to be the best. And it's not just that extrinsic motivation, rewards, is worse than intrinsic. It's that extrinsic motivation actively kills intrinsic motivation. Or to put it differently, rewards make people less interested in whatever they had to do to get the reward. Now, here's where a key distinction comes into play. Rewards are bad news, even if everybody in the class or the school, in theory, could get the reward, because rewards are about extrinsic motivation. What's worse than a reward is an award. An award is a reward that everybody can't get. If I get it, you can't. Competition takes the arsenic of trying to defeat other people and adds it to the strychnine of extrinsic motivation. It's bad enough if students are trying to get higher marks in school, because research consistently shows that students trying to get a 10 instead of a 4 or a 100 or whatever are less excited by learning, less likely to think deeply, and less likely to choose challenging tasks than those lucky enough not to have grades or marks. But you could take a bad thing and make it worse by ranking students against one another, where everybody by design can't get the highest mark. Or to put it differently, and to come back to my original point, competition kills excellence because it is the most poisonous of all extrinsic motivators. Other kinds of rewards are bad, but trying to beat other people is the worst. So competition is destructive to self-esteem, to our relationships with one another, and to success or excellence. We then need, as parents and children, to be thinking about how, step one, to help kids move beyond competition, which means changing the environments they're in to the extent possible, not just convincing them to be less competitive individually. It's a structural change. And second, the second step is to affirmatively create cooperative environments where they learn together. We can introspect for obvious ways where we ourselves sometimes assume this, where we say things to our children, where we do subtle forms of competition, like, who can tell me the answer to this question? And the kids are all waving their hands, and you've just set up a destructive contest where only one child can be first with the right answer. As an educator, I have problems with that, even regardless of the competitive aspect, because that's not a classroom about thinking, that's a classroom about rote memorization of right answers and pleasing the authority to get a high mark or test score. That's an anti-intellectual environment, but becomes worse when you set kids against one another. Who can be the quietest or best behaved student or group of students? Again, sets this up. Parents at home, okay kids, who can get into their pajamas fastest? This is not innocuous. This changes children. It socializes them. It teaches them to look upon even their own siblings at home and their classmates at school, not as potential allies, but as rivals to be bested. And we need to think about the ways we might be doing this. We need to bring children in on it, to discuss with them the effects of competition. I think there should be a unit in school where we explicitly teach all children about the destructive effects of competition, just as we teach them about the destructive effects of alcohol or substance abuse or reckless driving, because the research is that clear. The more we want to excel individually and as a group and as a whole society, the more we have to outgrow our childish belief that there has to be a competitive environment. Now, we can't change a whole country or a whole world overnight. In the short run, we should do everything possible to minimize competition in the systems we have some control over, like families and classrooms. And in the long term, we need to be organizing, educating, and mobilizing in the hopes of changing the system for all people so that we are able to create a healthier, more productive world and society. If you work in a school, you should be thinking also about how not only can we create more cooperative opportunities for children to learn together, but more cooperation among the faculty. Because ultimately we do more if we're able to collaborate professionally than if we're each stuck doing our own thing, or worse, having to compete for the favor of the school administrator or for being the most effective one, and so on. We need to affirmatively build community. And the one, I'm going to end with this piece, although because I can anticipate it's a question I'm often asked, which is something like, don't we have to prepare kids for a competitive world out there? Isn't it unrealistic to think that we can have them learn to cooperate and then they'll be blindsided by the fact that they often have to compete? Let me answer that very quickly, but in several ways. First, they get more than enough exposure to competition without our overdoing it then too. What they need from us is to be exposed to an alternative, to realize that competition isn't the way life works, it's the way dysfunctional institutions and cultures work. And they need to be taught how collaboration is an alternative. Nobody's going to be graduated from a school even without any competition and then get into a university or a workplace and go, whoa, what's this? Competition, how does that work? I've never seen that before. They get plenty of it without our help. Second, even if you thought a little exposure to competition would be helpful, all you need is a little to get the idea. Anything beyond that is diminishing returns. So how can we possibly justify immersing them in competition day after day after day, year after year? Third, if we want to prepare them to deal with a competitive environment, ultimately I hope to make it less competitive, but in the meantime to understand what's going on and not be handicapped by it, we talk to them about competition and how it works. You don't have to make them compete to understand what it is. When we teach children about fire safety, we discuss with them what you do if there's a fire. We don't set them on fire and say you have to do that in order to be prepared. Next, the benefits of failure are overrated. Students who keep failing don't learn to pick themselves up and succeed. More often, they think of themselves as failures, and it creates a vicious circle. The best predictor of success is the opportunity to experience success when you're young. But even if you thought that some experience with failure, which all kids have anyway, more than we think, was useful, you never need the uniquely destructive version of failure called losing, which is where you fail so that someone else can succeed and you do so publicly. And finally, the idea that you got to prepare them by having them compete makes no sense at all, because we want to create a better world. When people say, I'm just being realistic, that is a profoundly conservative argument where the status quo is able to perpetuate itself even if the current arrangement makes no sense. And if your question earlier was, hey, how come so many people are being competitive if you claim it's not part of human nature? This is why. Because enough people say, our society is competitive, so we have to raise you to fit in, then our children's children will be asking the same question. We will have perpetuated an arrangement that makes no sense to anyone because we believed we didn't have a choice. But we do. We want children to get into a competitive environment and say, this is terrible. It was so much better in my family and in my school where we were working with one another, not against one another. That was not only happier and healthier, it was a lot more effective at achievement for everybody. Now, when I get to a position of authority, I'm going to try to change this society rather than shrugging and accepting it as if it's just like the weather, something I've no control over. That's my basic argument, and I am now very eager to hear your questions about this, since I hope you understand that I am challenging you, I am respectfully inviting you not merely to ask how much competition or what kind, but why we would have any at all, and how we can move from any kind of competition to an environment that is at least non-competitive and at most cooperative. Thanks.